edition of Newsline. Here in Sri Lanka, given the current situation in the country, we are looking at really integrating ourselves with the global village. And to do that, of course, maintaining international relations is of utmost importance. Many questions have been raised on how Sri Lanka is handling the situation right now, at least on the international front, because we know for sure that we are not getting out of this rut without the support of the international community. And during the past few decades, we have made certain mistakes. We have forgotten certain historic friends. So it's very important to look at where Sri Lanka was historically. We speak a lot about our 2,500 years of history, our 2,500 years of heritage. But do we really understand this? Do we really use this heritage that Sri Lanka has to our advantage? To discuss these matters and much more, we've got today on our show Dr. Zameer Careem. He is a historian. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us on our program.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be on the show.
So, Zameer, let's start off with Sri Lanka's historic connections with the world. Now, certain things that we all know is that Sri Lanka had very close ties with countries like India. We didn't have very close ties with China, but we did maintain certain ties with China, European countries. But the world is increasingly becoming a smaller and smaller place. Let's start off with some of Sri Lanka's historic friends that we have forgotten right now.
Okay, so talking about Sri Lanka, given the geographic position of our country, the strategic location of Sri Lanka on the crossroads of the major maritime routes, we know that since the dim infancy of the world, Sri Lanka has played a pivotal role when it comes to maritime trade. So they have maintained very good relations, as you pointed out, with India, given that India is our neighboring country, with countries that now make up the Indian subcontinent, whether it be with Pakistan or with Bangladesh, as well as with the rest of India. We have maintained very close diplomatic, political, trade, cultural ties, as well as religious relations, which we have maintained since time immemorial. But then we have also played a pivotal role in terms of trade. So as a result of our strategic location, as you pointed out, we did maintain good ties with China since the time of Fahian, or even prior to the advent of Fahian and prior to the advent of various other explorers who came from China, and also with Southeast Asia. So whether it be with Myanmar, which was formerly Burma, likewise with Indonesia, with Malaya, when they were part of the Srivijayan Empire, for example. So even during this period, we maintained very close relations with those countries. I talk about Southeast Asia. Then talking about the Arabian Peninsula, as well as with Africa. Now, people have completely forgotten that we have very strong relations, which we have maintained since remote antiquity with the Arabian countries, with the Arabian Peninsula, as well as with Africa. So Africa is like a continent which we have forgotten, unfortunately. But since ancient times, even when we talk about the sacred Adam's Peak, we do know that there have been pilgrims who have surged into our country from every nook and cranny of the world, also from places like Africa, from Ethiopia, for example. So the Queen of Ethiopia, or the eunuch of Ethiopia, is believed to have visited our country. So Sri Lanka, as well as Adam's Peak in particular, was a sacred site, and we had pilgrims, we had traders who came from what is now Ethiopia, from Djibouti, from Eritrea, from the eastern coast of Africa, from Madagascar. I'm not talking about the colonial period, prior to the colonial era, and prior to the colonial period as well, we maintained very good relations with Europe. So normally when we talk about our historical relations with Europe, we normally believe that it's during the colonial period, but even during the whole Roman Empire, during the Greek Empire, even during the Byzantine times, we had very strong relations with what is now Europe, as well as with countries like Turkey, for example, or Turkey as it is known right now. So unfortunately, not many Sri Lankans, when it comes to youngsters, we all suffer from what is called historical amnesia. Not many youngsters are conscious of the fact that Sri Lanka has maintained very strong relations with countries like Turkey, as well as with Central and Southeast Europe. And what is the government doing right now, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the diplomatic missions that are based in these countries, particularly nations like Austria, for example, they're trying to raise awareness about the historical relations and on our contacts. Because since ancient times, as I mentioned earlier, given the strategic location and the commodities which we produced in Sri Lanka, so elephants, pearls, garnets, the spices, cinnamon, and many other precious, invaluable commodities were in fact exported to these countries. So usually you had the Roman traders, the Persian traders, Turkish traders, Arabs, Africans used to come to Ceylon and then procure all these goods and then take these goods to those parts of the world, including Europe. Likewise, you had the Chinese and then those who came from the Far East, as well as from Southeast Asia. Those trading vessels used to visit Sri Lanka, get all their resources here. So it was basically the most important trading hub. So this is prior to the colonial period, and when you look into our history, you'll come across many kings who maintained very strong relations, the most notable among them being Parakram Bahu the Great. So we had ministers who were proficient in languages like Sanskrit, Greek, Chinese, and even Persian. So even if you read the writings of Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan Berber explorer, so when he came to our country in 1344, he writes, he in fact identifies the king of Sri Lanka as Sultan Arya Chakravarti. So Sultan is basically a title that is used mainly to identify Muslim leaders, Muslim kings. But we did maintain good relations with the Persian Empire and other Muslim empires at the time. But this is in the 14th century. So he writes that Sri Lanka maintained good relations with countries like Yemen. We had trading vessels sent to those parts of the world. And what's interesting is that even Ibn Battuta mentions that in Sri Lanka there were Persians and other communities residing. And Colombo was under the control of this sea lord called Jalesti, and he had 400 Habshis in his army. So Habshis are basically Africans, those who hailed from Abyssinia, which is present-day Ethiopia. So talking about 14th century, we had people who hailed from Africa who were here. We had Romans, we had people from the Byzantine Empire, monks, missionaries, traders, explorers, scholars, even physicians, even from countries like Turkey. You won't believe there have been physicians who came to our country in search of herbs, in search of spices, in search of pearls and various other commodities which were exported to that part of the world. So they were here, they established themselves over here, and our country has always been known as a very warm and hospitable nation. So we had in fact provided refuge to those who were fleeing their countries. Even when you look into our history, those who in fact settled in our nation, starting from the advent of Prince Vijaya and his 700 followers, and then eventually during the reign of Parakram Bahu the Great, we had, as I mentioned, we had many diplomats and scholars who hailed from different parts of the world who came to our country. And there was also this explorer who came to our nation called Al-Idrisi in the 12th century. So he writes that Sri Lanka was home not just to Sinhalese, Buddhist, Tamils and other communities that we know, but Sri Lanka was also home to Jews, Musendans and Manichaeans, and those religious groups also lived in our country. Sri Lanka was also home to Zoroastrians who came from Persia, and we still have the Zoroastrian population in Sri Lanka. So we had the Parsis in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, when I go to universities and deliver lectures on ethnic cohesion and social harmony, what is very difficult to kind of digest is the fact that many of our youngsters have absolutely no idea that Sri Lanka is home to a plethora of ethnic and religious groups. They only know of the Sinhalese and the Tamils, and because of this ethnic division and the ethnic war that we had for 30 years that separated our country on ethnic lines, people only focus on the Sinhalese and Tamils and have forgotten the contributions made by many other ethnic and religious groups in our country. And that was the whole reason behind doing Lost and Forgotten on MTV News First. And that was to kind of highlight, and it was wholly devoted to raising awareness about minority groups in Sri Lanka.
So you spoke about social harmony and the fact that so many people lived together in Sri Lanka, even from years and years ago. You also said that the younger generation, of course, doesn't pay too much of heed to the history of our nation, to the rich history of our nation. But of course, how can you blame them when there are so many subjects to study in school?
True.
But Zameer, really, how important is it for us to understand our historical roots in our quest towards development, in our quest towards engaging better with the international community, and most importantly, in our quest to achieve social harmony here in Sri Lanka?
As I keep saying, if you do not know where you come from, you'll never appreciate where you're going. So history plays a pivotal role in understanding the mistakes that were committed in the past and to make sure that we do not repeat those mistakes and we rectify them. So what we could learn a great deal from our past, and given that Sri Lanka has maintained very good relations, unfortunately not many people have in fact indulged in the whole process of researching our historical relations. Like as you mentioned, yes, we do know our historical ties with India and with China, but we did maintain historical ties even with countries like Turkey, for example. So over the last 11 months during my time in Turkey, I realized that not many Turks do know about Sri Lanka, and not many Sri Lankans know that Turkey is a country that is a secular nation. Many of my friends have in fact asked me, do Turks speak Arabic? And do you find camels in Turkey? So I was flabbergasted to learn that not many Sri Lankans do know that the Turks have been visiting our country since remote antiquity, since the Byzantine era. So even prior to the advent of the Turks and prior to the introduction of Islam in the region, we have had monks, we had pilgrims, we had physicians. Even during the Seljuk era, after the arrival of the Turks as well, the Seljuks maintained very close ties with South India as well as with Sri Lanka. Likewise, as I mentioned earlier, while exploring the historical relations with countries like Austria, Southeast Asia, people have no idea that we had good relations with countries like Czech Republic or with what is present-day Slovenia, Slovakia, erstwhile Yugoslavia. This is prior to the colonial period. Even during the time of the Holy Roman Empire, during the Greek Empire, during the Roman Empire, and even with countries in Africa. Now, the reason why it's important, it is timely and necessary and pertinent to explore the historical relations, is that at right now, in order for us to strengthen our diplomatic, our cultural, our political relations with countries, I think history would play a pivotal role, and it would be, in fact, a good medium, an effective tool in order to strengthen our ties. Because when you really go deliver lectures in countries like Austria or in Czech Republic or in these countries like Slovenia, Slovakia, as I mentioned, they are surprised to learn that there have been people from their countries, including places like Hungary. There have been ministers, royals, aside from those pilgrims and traders and missionaries who came to our country, there have been aristocrats who came from that part of the world. There were scientists, there were scholars, there were botanists, there were archaeologists, there were historians who came, and even royals. And the reason they came, aside from trophy hunting, which was huge at the time, that is big game hunting, hunting elephants in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was the destination when it came to elephant hunting, and people used to come to our country, shoot elephants, and then collect their relics and take them back to countries in Europe. So it was popular during the colonial period. And even during the colonial period, there were scientists who came to our country, and Ceylon was a prosperous nation. Now, the reason why the Europeans came to our country is because of the fact that we had the commodities, we had the natural resources, we are rich in resources aside from the minerals and the gems and the sapphires. If you really look into the history of Europe and then European crown jewels, the jewels that were worn by the aristocrats and the royals and the squires, whether be in Britain or the rest of Europe, you'll realize that most of these jewels that are exhibited over there, and the ivory, objects that are made of ivory, whether be in Persia or in the Arabian Peninsula, even if you visit all these museums in Europe, you'll be surprised to find that most of these items in fact went from Ceylon. So Ceylonese sapphires were used by the Carolingian Empire, whether it be the talisman of Charlemagne or whether it be the jewels that were worn by all these royals, whether it be Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth II, or dating back to 12th century Edward's crown, or whichever royal crown and royal possessions. If you really go through their history and realize where did these sapphires come from, because our sapphires were prized and highly sought after, from Marco Polo to Fahien and all these renowned explorers at the time, even Ibn Battuta. When you read their itineraries, when you read their writings, you'll be surprised to learn that our country was so important at the time. And then during the colonial period, starting from the 16th century all the way up until the mid 20th century, the reason why Europeans came to Ceylon is looking for better opportunities, seeking greener pastures. Like how Sri Lankans right now are migrating to foreign lands looking for better opportunities, back then from Europe, aside from what we now know as United Kingdom, Netherlands and Portugal, who controlled our country, the maritime provinces, and then the British managed to control the entire nation. But aside from those who came from those countries, you'll be surprised that there were people from Russian Federation, then the Russian Empire, from Prussia, which is now present-day Germany, from Luxembourg. There were regiments sent to Ceylon. So there were soldiers from countries like Luxembourg, from Liechtenstein, from countries like Austria, Slovenia, artists, impressionists, scholars, scientists, zoologists who wanted to kind of explore. There were all these scientific expeditions at the time, so they wanted to kind of go around, look for resources, procure those resources. We do know that colonial period was a time of exploitation, depredation, outright theft, looting carried out by the Europeans, but at the same time Ceylon was a rich country at the time during the colonial period. When you compare ourselves with the rest of Asia, particularly South Asia, and even at the time of our independence, we were considered a prosperous nation at the time. Our status of living, our standard of living was much higher than most of the countries at the time. And that was one of the reasons why, when we really explore our history, especially when it comes to people who settled in our country, and our nation was a very diverse country. Now, youngsters have forgotten that Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as the nation was called, has always been a very cosmopolitan, diverse nation. So we have had people from all these countries who had settled in Ceylon. Even if you go through our census, the 1871 census, for example, that got rid of the whole caste system and introduced race and nationality. When you read the writings of all these explorers, as I mentioned, when you read their writings, including the royals, even Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, who was assassinated, whose death incited the First World War, even if you read his writings about the country, you'll realize that he has also made mention of various communities whom he came across during his sojourn in Ceylon. Likewise, the writings of all these royals. If you read the writings of Irish captain Robert Percival, so this is in the early 19th century, so he writes how cosmopolitan Colombo was, and he says that Colombo was the most cosmopolitan of all cities in the whole of the Indian subcontinent, and the very first Dutch envoy to Ceylon, Joris van Spilbergen. So when he arrived, this is in 1602, forget about the maritime provinces. Yes, the maritime provinces were exposed to Europeans because we have the important ports, whether it be Colombo, Gaul, Trincomalee, but then the Kandyan kingdom, at the time the ruler was Vimradharma Surya. So even Vimradharma Surya had Turks, had Moors, had renegade Portuguese, had Sinhalese, and then Kafirs, the Africans. So Sri Lanka, even during the 17th century, even the Kandyan kingdom had people from all these races, from all these nationalities, who had lived in friendly brotherhood, pooling the resources of each for the benefit of all. And unfortunately, when it comes to whole ethnic cohesion and social harmony, not many youngsters really know how cosmopolitan our country was. And unfortunately, we still use derogatory, pejorative terms like kafir to identify a rich, vibrant community like the Africans. So the Afro-Sri Lankans who have lived in this country even prior to the arrival of the Europeans. During the colonial period, there were many Africans who were brought to work as slaves, soldiers and mercenaries. They were responsible for the erection of all these impregnable fortresses that we find in our country. You take Colombo Fort, for example, there were over 4,000 African soldiers who were put to work. So it's their blood, sweat and toil, not just those who came from Africa, those who also came from India. There were Indian laborers who were brought to this country. Likewise, there were laborers, there were soldiers, there were royals who were exiled from Dutch East Indies and from Malaya, the present day Malay community. So their forefathers hailed from what is Southeast Asia, from Malaya, British Malaya, and from Southeast Asia's Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. So all these people were responsible in the construction of all these fortresses. And unfortunately, all that we remember, or when we talk about history, we are forgetting the contributions made by various communities, and that's unfortunately tragic.
So, speaking about, of course, disseminating this information, educating the youth about Sri Lanka's history, how diverse, how vibrant, and how much of harmony there was in Sri Lanka in the past, even during the presence of many, many more communities that are now available here in Sri Lanka. Do you really think that Sri Lanka's educational curriculum, since you're an academic yourself, do you think that it really caters to achieving this goal of disseminating the important parts? Because now, as much as you might have a vast understanding, a massive amount of knowledge on the history of Sri Lanka as well as the world, given your position as a historian, not everyone can quite grasp or understand or at least accumulate that amount of knowledge. So how best is it to give the best parts of history to Sri Lanka's youth so that they could obviously learn from their mistakes and create a better future?
True, as you rightly pointed out, unfortunately the curriculum, so when I was in school I wasn't taught anything concerning various communities that lived in the country. I had absolutely no idea about communities like the Parsis or the Sindhis or the Boras or the Maimans and their contributions to the society. And as you said, even if you go to talk about cultural awareness, I think it should start when it comes to places like institutions, educational institutions in schools. The curriculum has to undergo tremendous change. Likewise, even if you visit museums, unfortunately, the topic that I've been discussing in the recent past has been representation of minorities in museums. You go to the Colombo National Museum, yes, there is a textile gallery, there are a few communities that are represented, the Sinhalese, Tamils, the Malays, the Burghers, the Moors are represented. Then what about other minorities and other ethnic and religious groups that reside in this country? The Parsis, for example, the Sindhis, Boras, Chettis, Khojars, Maimans, the Africans who live in our country. And as I mentioned earlier, communities we should stop using all these pejorative, contemptuous, insulting terms to identify certain minority groups in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, the youngsters have absolutely no idea about the contributions made by individuals who belong to other communities. Like, for example, even when we talk about Sri Lanka's fight for independence, we have to in fact constantly remind our youngsters that we had people like Sir Ponnambalam Ravanathan, who in fact filed a petition during the colonial period for the Sinhalese war heroes to be released from prison. And it was Sir Ponnambalam Ramanathan who played a huge role, this is in the 1800s, in the 19th century, in order for Vesak to be celebrated as a national holiday in Ceylon. So it was done by a man who hailed from Jaffna. And then when it comes to his brother, Sir Ponnambalam Arunachalam, he was instrumental along with Sir James Pieris and Sir Marcus Fernando. So they were pioneers in establishing the University of Ceylon. And likewise, when you really look into our history, 1931, a significant year for Ceylon, because Ceylon became the very first Asian country and the first British colony in the world to in fact accept universal franchise. So women were given the right to vote. And this was achieved in Sri Lanka under the Donamo Constitution. And talking about the ladies who were part of it, who spearheaded the whole movement, we had people like Agnes Nell de Silva. So Agnes Nell was in fact a Dutch burgher. Likewise, we had ladies like Nallama Murugesa, who was in fact a physician from Jaffna. So she started this movement in the 1920s, early 1920s. And this was a lady who was a physician from Jaffna who wanted the women to be given the right to vote. And then when Agnes Nell de Silva was questioned whether the Indian Tamils, the indentured laborers who were brought to work on the plantations of our country, should their women also be given the right to vote, she said yes. And that really shows that our women at the time, in the 1930s, 1920s, we had women from different walks of life representing various communities who fought for a common cause. We had Doreen Young Wickramasinghe. We're also forgetting about the Jews who came to our country. So when we talk about the Holocaust and people being persecuted as a result of this whole religious propaganda and all that happening in Europe, Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as the nation was then called, was a refuge for all those emigres, all those Jews who came to our country. There was a significant number of Jews who settled in our country during the colonial period, and unfortunately our youngsters have absolutely no idea that people like, for example, when you go to Kandy, you have this Kandy clock tower, and the Kandy clock tower was erected by a gentleman named Muhammad Ismail, who was a Muslim. And it is built according to the Sinhalese traditional architecture. Likewise, you go to the Sima Malak temple, which is part of the Gangaramaya temple. So this temple, when it was in a state of a dilapidated state, had fallen to wreck and ruin in the 1970s. They wanted to kind of reconstruct the building and revamp the whole place. So the architect behind it was Jeffrey Bawa, who was someone of Muslim, European, Sinhalese, French heritage. And then the person who in fact financed the whole construction was Musaji, who was a Bora. And likewise, you go to Colombo, you have all these clock towers and lighthouses and all that. So when you see Khan Clock Tower, the Khan Memorial Clock Tower, and there was a Khan Memorial Hospital, and these people presume, okay, because the surname is Khan, it was erected probably by a Muslim merchant, but the answer is no, it was built by the Parsis, by Zoroastrians who believe in this religion called Zoroastrianism, which is one of the oldest still practiced monotheistic religion. So unfortunately, when you talk about the Zoroastrians, you have to ask students, do you know Ratan Tata, for example? So Ratan Tata, Poonawala's, Godrej in India, so they're all part of the whole Parsi community. So the Parsi community, a mercantile community in Sri Lanka, I do not want to mention names of some of the largest conglomerates in Sri Lanka, are run by the Parsis. The Sindhis, for example, unfortunately they don't know that the Khan Clock Tower was built in memory of Framji Bikaji Khan. There's a Framji house in Methodist College. There was in fact a hospital that was donated. And not just these minorities, but even when you talk about the flag of Sri Lanka, in 1948, prior to us gaining independence in February, in January, it was a Mudaliyar from Batiklo called Ahmed Lebbe Sinelebbe who proposed the idea of adapting the royal standard of the Kandyan kingdom as the national flag of our country. Unfortunately, not many youngsters know it, and when this proposal was put forth in January 1948, there was a lot of opposition. Yes, there was a council formed under the leadership of Right Honourable D.S. Senanayaka, who was our first premier, and then there were people like Gigi Ponnambalam, S. Nadesan, there were many Tamils and those of other communities who were part of this council who accepted the whole singular flag, the national flag, to be the lion flag which was used during the Kandyan kingdom. So unfortunately, stories about the representation of communities are not known to the youngsters of our country. So that's a plight.
Well, of course, Zameer, you've given us quite a lot of information about Sri Lanka's rich history, but however, unfortunately, this rich history, or only very, very little of it, is taught to the youth in Sri Lanka. And there needs to be a lot done, of course, for people not to just learn history, but to really understand it, and in the end use it to our advantage to build a better future. And of course, academics like you taking Sri Lanka's name to the international community, educating the international community about their historic ties with Sri Lanka, and also Sri Lanka's historic ties with those countries, is definitely playing an important role in Sri Lanka's journey towards development. Thank you very much, Dr. Zameer Careem, for joining us on our program today. Thank you very much, as always, to all our viewers out there for tuning in to another episode of Newsline. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.
चाहूं मैं आना अपने तू दिल का पता दे, चाहूं मैं आना इतना बता दूं तुझको, चाहत पे अपनी मुझको यूं तो नहीं तैयार, फिर भी ये सोचा दिल ने अब जो लगी हूँ मिलने, पूछूं तुझे एक बार, तू ही ये मुझको बता दे, चाहूं मैं आना अपने तू दिल का पता दे, चाहूं मैं आना। ऐसी कभी पहले कोई ना थी ख्वाहिश।